Lesson 3. Diplomacy. It matters because the United States' influence continued to expand into foreign countries. President Theodore Roosevelt mediated disputes in Asia and Latin America and acquired the Panama Canal Zone. Presidents Taft and Wilson increased U.S. trade and influence in Latin America. American diplomacy in Asia. Guiding question. Why did the United States want to eliminate spheres of influence in China? In 1899, the United States was a major power in Asia, with naval bases all across the Pacific. Operating from those bases, the United States Navy, by then the world's third largest navy, could exert American power anywhere in East Asia. The nation's main interest in Asia, however, was not conquest, but commerce. Between 1895 and 1900, U.S. exports to China quadrupled. Although China bought only about 2% of U.S. exports, the vast Chinese markets excited American business leaders, especially those in the textile, oil, and steel industries. The open door policy. In 1894, war erupted between China and Japan over Korea, which was a client state dependent upon China. Western observers were astonished when Japan easily defeated China's massive military. The war showed that Japan had mastered Western technology and that China was weaker than anyone had thought. In the peace treaty, China recognized Korea's independence and gave Japan territory in Manchuria. The Russians were concerned about Japan's rising power. They did not want Japan to acquire the territory in Manchuria because it bordered Russia. Backed by France and Germany, Russia forced Japan to return the Manchurian territory it had acquired. Then, in 1898, Russia demanded China lease the territory to Russia instead. Leasing meant the territory would still belong to China, even though a foreign government would maintain overall control. Soon, Germany, France, and Britain also demanded leaseholds in China. Each leasehold became the center of a country's sphere of influence, an area where a foreign nation controlled economic development. U.S. politicians and businessmen worried about these events. President McKinley and Secretary of State John Hay both supported what they called an open door policy, which would allow all countries to trade with China. In 1899, Hay asked countries with leaseholds in China not to discriminate against other nations wanting to do business in their sphere of influence. Each nation responded by saying it accepted the open door policy, but would not follow it unless all the others agreed. Once Hay had received assurances from all of the nations with leaseholds, he declared that the United States expected the other powers to uphold the policy. The Boxer Rebellion. While foreign countries debated access to China's market, secret Chinese societies organized to fight foreign control and influence. One group, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, was known to Westerners as the Boxers. In 1900, this group decided to destroy both the Foreign Devils and their Chinese Christian converts, whom they believed were corrupting Chinese society. In what came to be called the Boxer Rebellion, the Boxers and some Chinese troops attacked foreign embassies in Peking, now Beijing, and Tientsin, now Tianjin, killing more than 200 foreigners, including many Christian missionaries. After the German ambassador to China was killed, 8 nations, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States intervened. A large multinational force rescued the foreigners and ended the rebellion. During the crisis, Secretary of State John Hay worked with British diplomats to persuade the other powers not to partition China. In a second set of open door notes, Hay convinced the participating powers to accept compensation from China for damages caused by the rebellion. After some discussion, the powers agreed not to break up China into European-controlled colonies. The United States retained access to China's lucrative trade in tea, spices, and silk, and gained a larger market for its own goods. Roosevelt and Taft's diplomacy. Guiding question. Was President Roosevelt correct in his belief that a strong military presence promoted global peace? President McKinley was re-elected in 1900, but his second term was cut short by an assassin's bullet. After McKinley's death in September 1901, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency. Roosevelt favored increasing U.S. power. He also accepted some of Anglo-Saxonism's ideas. He believed that the United States had a duty to shape the less civilized corners of the earth. Balancing power in East Asia. President Roosevelt supported the open-door policy in China and worked to prevent any nation from controlling trade there. To that end, he helped negotiate a resolution to a war between Japan and Russia that had begun in 1904. At a 1905 peace conference, Roosevelt helped to mediate Russia's recognition of Japan's territorial gains. He also persuaded Japan to stop seeking further territory. In the years after the treaty, relations between the United States and Japan steadily grew worse. As the two nations vied for greater influence in Asia, they pledged to respect each other's territorial possessions, uphold the open-door policy, and support China's independence. The Panama Canal. Roosevelt believed that displaying U.S. power to the world would deter nations from fighting. He expressed this belief with a West African saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." His big stick policy was evident in the U.S. acquisition and construction of the Panama Canal. He and others believed that having a canal through Central America was vital to U.S. power in the world and would save time and money for commercial and military shipping. In 1889, a French company abandoned its efforts to build a canal in Panama. In 1902, Congress authorized the U.S. purchase of the French company's assets and the construction of a canal. Panama was a province of Colombia at that time. In 1903, the United States offered Colombia a large sum of money and yearly rent for the right to build the canal and to control a narrow strip of land on either side of it. When Colombia refused, tension increased between Colombia and Panamanians, who opposed Colombian rule. Worried that the United States might back out of its offer, the French company met with Panamanian officials and decided to make a deal with the United States. In November 1903, with U.S. warships looming offshore, Panama revolted against Colombia. Within days, the United States recognized Panama's independence, and the two nations signed a treaty allowing the canal to be built, ensuring the canal stayed in Panama. During the construction, malaria and yellow fever, transmitted by mosquitoes, sickened workers and slowed their progress. By inspecting and controlling all potential breeding places, Surgeon General of the U.S. Army William Crawford Gorgas helped maintain a canal zone in which mosquitoes could not live. His efforts minimized disease and allowed workers to continue the building of the canal. The Roosevelt Corollary. By the early 1900s, American officials had become concerned about large debts that Latin American nations owed European banks. In 1902, after Venezuela defaulted on its debts, Britain, Germany, and Italy blockaded Venezuelan ports. The crisis was resolved peacefully after the United States pressed both sides to reach an agreement. Roosevelt then gave an address to Congress in which he stated what came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It stated that the United States would intervene in Latin American affairs when necessary to maintain economic and political stability in the Western Hemisphere. The goal of the Roosevelt Corollary was to prevent European powers from using the debt problems of Latin America to justify intervening in the region. The United States first applied the Roosevelt Corollary in the Dominican Republic, which had fallen behind on its debt payments to European nations. In 1905, the United States began collecting custom tariffs in the Dominican Republic using the Marine Corps as its agent. Analyzing primary sources. Roosevelt corollary. Chronic wrongdoing may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Theodore Roosevelt from his fourth annual message to Congress, December 6, 1904. Dollar diplomacy. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, placed less emphasis on military force and more on economic development. Taft believed that supporting Latin American industry would increase trade and profits for American businesses and lift American countries out of poverty and social disorder. His policy came to be called dollar diplomacy. To give Europeans less reason to intervene in Latin American affairs, Taft's administration worked to replace European loans with loans from American banks. American bankers began making loans to Nicaragua to support its shaky government. The next year, civil unrest forced Nicaragua's president to ask for greater assistance. U.S. Marines entered Nicaragua, replaced the customs collector with an American agent, and formed a committee to control the customs commissions. U.S. troops supported the government and customs until 1933. Progress check. Explaining. Why was it important for the United States to influence Latin American nations? Woodrow Wilson's diplomacy in Mexico. Guiding question. How did moral diplomacy shape President Wilson's foreign policy? It would be the irony of fate, said Woodrow Wilson just before he was inaugurated in 1913, if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. Wilson had written books on state government, Congress, and George Washington, as well as a history of the nation. His experience and interests were in domestic policy. He was a university professor before entering politics and was a committed progressive. Foreign affairs, however, absorbed much of Wilson's time and energy as president. Wilson opposed imperialism. He believed that democracy was essential to a nation's stability and prosperity. He wanted the United States to promote democracy to create a world free of revolution and war. He hoped the United States would lead by moral example, but his first international crisis thwarted that hope. The Mexican Revolution. For more than 30 years, Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico as a dictator. During Diaz's reign, Mexico became much more industrialized, but foreign investors owned and financed the new railroads and factories that were built. Most Mexican citizens remained poor and landless. In 1910, discontent erupted into revolution. Francisco Madero, a reformer who seemed to support democracy, constitutional government, and land reform, led the revolution. Madero, however, proved to be an unskilled administrator. Worried about Madero's plans for land reform, conservative forces plotted against him. In 1913, General Victoriano Huerta seized power, and Madero was murdered. Huerta's brutality repulsed Wilson, who refused to recognize the new government. Instead, Wilson announced a new policy. To win U.S. recognition, groups that seized power in Latin America would have to establish a government based on law, not on force. Wilson believed that, without U.S. support, Huerta soon would be overthrown. Meanwhile, Wilson ordered the Navy to intercept arms shipments to Huerta's government. He also permitted Americans to arm Huerta's opponents. Wilson sends troops into Mexico. In April 1914, American sailors visiting the Mexican city of Tampico were arrested after entering a restricted area. Although they were quickly released, their American commander demanded an apology. The Mexicans refused. Wilson saw the refusal as an opportunity to overthrow Huerta. He asked Congress to authorize the use of force, and shortly after Congress passed the resolution, he learned that a German ship was unloading weapons at the Mexican port of Veracruz. Wilson immediately ordered American warships to Veracruz, where U.S. Marines forcibly seized the city. Although the president expected the Mexican people to welcome his action, anti-American riots broke out. Wilson then accepted international mediation to settle the dispute. Venustiano Carranza, whose forces had acquired arms from the United States, became Mexico's president. Mexican forces opposed to Carranza were not appeased, and they conducted raids into the United States, hoping to force Wilson to intervene. In March 1916, Pancho Villa and a group of guerrillas, armed fighters who carry out surprise attacks, burned the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17 Americans. Wilson responded by sending about 5,800 troops under General John J. Pershing across the border to find and capture Villa. The expedition dragged on with no success. Wilson's growing concern over the war raging in Europe finally caused him to recall Pershing's troops in 1917. Wilson's Mexican policy damaged U.S. foreign relations. The British ridiculed the president's attempt to shoot the Mexicans into self-government. Latin Americans regarded his moral imperialism as no improvement over Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. In fact, Wilson followed Roosevelt's example in the Caribbean. In 1914, he negotiated exclusive rights for naval bases and a canal with Nicaragua. In 1915, he sent Marines into Haiti to put down a rebellion. The Marines remained there until 1934. In 1916, he sent troops into the Dominican Republic to preserve order and to set up a government he hoped would be more stable and democratic than the current regime.